Next, full adulthood. A burst of energy. Eleanor and Franklin. The 1929 Great Crash set the grassroots afire. Countless working middle-class Americans who, quote, play by the rules, unquote, went broke, jobless, homeless, destitute. Barons with cash snapped up bankrupt farms, homes, factories, futures, and ignited a grassroots class hatred that threatened a new revolution. Our fourth cycle of history conjured new chieftains to guide this latest burst of energy. Previously, there were Good King Billy, Andy Jackson, Brian Debs, Teddy Wilson. Now they were a tenuously married couple. He was in a wheelchair. She was Eleanor. As usual, not much real value anchored all that crazed Roaring '20s end-of-cycle casino madness. As in 1819, 1837, 1857, 1873, and 1893, first came panic, then came crash. In 1907, the Feds bailed out the big banks, as they would again exactly a century later. But after 1929, our second Great Depression ate us all. Germany had pulled itself back up from war and reparations. Now it utterly collapsed, kicking in the door for Adolf Hitler. Here, one day, we were fat, happy, nearly full employed. The next day, we were cold, hungry, homeless, and jobless. Hooverville tent colonies stretched from sea to sea. We were dazed and confused, desperate for a beer. Hamilton's corporate aristocracy had conquered America. Progressive regulation was a near total failure. The 1888 Sherman Antitrust Act, meant to restore market competition, was used to crush labor unions. The Clayton Antitrust Act, labor's Magna Carta, was weak, then died. Corporate flunkies turned regulatory agencies into baronial lapdogs. But now, amidst terrible poverty, the unions fought back. Farm labor campaigns raged through the upper Midwest. Norman Thomas sustained the spirit of social democracy. Then came the bonus army. The vets who fought Woodrow Wilson's war were promised a pension payable in 1945, but they needed it now. Thousands marched on the White House, expecting to get bailed out, like the bankers. With some small exceptions, Herbert Hoover would not let the people's government help its desperate citizens. Hobo camps filled with angry Americans who deserved better and knew it. Their bonus army came to camp in the Anacostia Flats, the very swamp Madison and Jefferson had dickered over with Alexander Hamilton at that fancy dinner in 1790. Hoover, raised a Quaker, refused to meet with the marching veterans. Generals Douglas MacArthur, George Patton, and Dwight Eisenhower torched the camp, then opened fire. 2 vets died. The great engineer and his smug GOP were now political dead meat. As the grassroots raged, a charismatic New York Democrat came to power alongside the American century's most powerful matriarch, the better angel of our feminist soul. The Roosevelt's 1932 landslide said do something, anything, to end the Depression. But except for legalizing booze and singing Happy Days Are Here Again, the Roosevelts had scant idea what that would be. FDR had already been to the mountaintop. Handsome, clever, and rich, Franklin's domineering mother prepped him for the presidency from birth. Cousin Teddy gifted him a celebrity name and, more importantly, the ugly duckling niece who became his best attribute. Wilson made FDR Undersecretary of the Navy. The 1920 Democrats ran him for VP. But in the summer of 1921, Franklin swam in cold Canadian waters, then ran off to fight a fire. Chilled to the bone, he awoke the next morning and never walked again. Like Lincoln's melancholia, like JFK's war wounds, polio deeply tested the chords of FDR's very soul. Somehow, through depression, war, and worse, he exuded a relentless healing spirit that transcended his well-hidden depths of personal despair. At Warm Springs, Georgia, Franklin built a pioneering polio treatment center where thousands sought to heal. Had he never been president, Franklin Roosevelt would still be justly revered for his boundless compassion and relentless optimism in the face of terrible personal suffering. With a seriously pumped upper body, FDR used railings, banisters, and his son's arm to give the illusion that he could walk. He sat behind a desk for Oval Office press conferences, spoke from podiums with hidden supports, referred in public to his leg braces only at the very end. But it was Eleanor who made him. Working New York's back channels, she engineered Franklin's governorship, then his presidency, when really it should have been hers. Though not exactly passionate and private, Franklin and Eleanor were the ultimate power couple. Franklin's radio broadcast fireside chats enhanced Eleanor's daily newspaper column, which ran virtually everywhere. The, quote, first lady of the world, close quote, and America's second richest woman, traveled where her husband could not. She visited farms, factories, mines, mills, slums, and tenements, poor houses and hospitals, even the California concentration camps, where Franklin jailed 10,000 Japanese Americans for no good reason. Race, class, religion, ethnicity, sexual preference, nothing slowed Eleanor's gritty resolve to touch and inspire her fellow humans. Alice Paul's Equal Rights Amendment languished through the decades, but Eleanor birthed a new sense of matriarchy and an America that should be run by women. Frances Perkins became our first female cabinet secretary of labor. Policy-wise, the Roosevelts made another halfway covenant between corporate capitalism and American socialism. Had Debs's American Socialist Party survived Wilson's putsch, public ownership of our key financial and industrial institutions might have driven the national dialogue. Norman Thomas and a small but vocal Communist Party still demanded it. The Roosevelts didn't go there. Often branded a socialist, FDR was, like Bernie Sanders, a social democrat. He did not favor public ownership of the corporations, but he did want them to be carefully constrained as creatures of the law and the servants of the people. Like the greatest Franklin before him, FDR loved to experiment. Tom Paine said all humans deserved the basics of life. Lincoln said we could not survive half slave and half free. Now the Roosevelts would not abide, quote, 1/3 of a nation, ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished, close quote. The Roosevelts used scattershot agencies and executive orders to do what Hoover's GOP would not, make the government tend to the, quote, general welfare, unquote, as the Haudenosaunee and founders saw to be the proper role for a People's Council. The New Deal's key agencies had initials like CCC, PWA, WPA, NRA, AAA. Its barrage of Band-Aids created millions of jobs and helped countless Americans in desperate need. Social Security, food stamps, child labor laws, the right to organize, all major social programs of the New Deal, and later the New Frontier and Great Society, flowed straight from the wellspring of an angry populace. In the spirit of the Chimera Cavova, they demanded the government act like a tribe and do its part for the whole human family. That also meant restraints on corporate greed. The FDIC would guarantee bank deposits. The SEC would regulate the stock market. Glass-Steagall would curb bank speculations. While reigning in the barons, the New Deal created millions of jobs, enhanced our relationship with Mother Earth, breathed new life back into our body politic, offered the vision of a nation free from poverty, diffused what might have become a violent revolution. As FDR and even his fiercest critics well knew, the New Deal saved corporate capitalism. From 1933, when he proclaimed that, quote, happy days are here again, unquote, until 1937, when Franklin seemed to lose his nerve, the Roosevelt's New Deal was a spectacular success. It all hinged on an improbable coalition of industrial unions, racial minorities, Southern racists, urban intellectuals, angry farmers, populist poets, and millions more with little in common beyond a desperate need to get our tribe back to work. Franklin's fellow rich hated the New Deal and him. They were economic royalists, son of barons who could never get enough money. When Franklin suggested they might consider sharing their wealth, their sociopathic Puritan rage turned literally murderous. In 1933, General Smedley Butler told Congress that members of the Rockefeller, Mellon, Morgan, DuPont, and Remington clans had offered him $3 million to arm 500,000 fascists, overthrow the government, and kill the president. Butler had spent the dollar diplomacy 20s as a, quote, racketeer for Wall Street, close quote, using the U.S. military to pillage Latin America for corporate profit. But Butler's shocking revelations of the, quote, business plotters, unquote, plan to assassinate FDR were suppressed. Where nonviolent peace activists were imprisoned long after armistice, not a single murderous millionaire was jailed for this armed conspiracy to gut our government. Their billionaire European cohorts won power in Spain. Italy's Mussolini gave corporations control of his state. Americans like Joseph P. Kennedy, father of President number 36, Prescott Bush, father and grandfather of Presidents 41 and 43, Henry Ford and Charles Lindbergh loudly supported Hitler's Germany. Der Führer's National Socialism, a term fondly used by TR, transformed the fatherland into a corporate hell. Hitler's pledge to, quote, make Germany great again, unquote, demanded its, quote, silent majority, unquote, conquer the electorate. Adolf's fascism was all about fear of Jews, Bolsheviks, Slavs, Jehovah's Witnesses, Muslims, heretics, trade unions, gays, the disabled, the past, the future, and most of all, the present. But the Roosevelts preached a gospel of optimistic goodwill. Quote, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, close quote. Their miracle was holding together a bitterly divided society while trying whatever they could do to restore prosperity. Some of it actually worked. Overseas, their good neighbor policy brought a rare stretch of imperial restraint. Pretty much alone among modern American presidents, FDR mostly refrained from invading smaller countries. What a concept. That was liked by Senator Gerald Nye, a North Dakota Republican. In riveting 1935-36 hearings, as Joe Stalin conducted show trials in the Soviet Union, Nye confirmed what America already knew. Woodrow Wilson had lied us into war, let us die to protect robber baron loans, let us freeze to save rich Russians from their own people, and jailed those Americans who objected, including Eugene V. Debs. America, Nye said, was suckered into an insane mass slaughter and a fascist Red Scare aimed at killing social democracy. Still loyal to Woodrow, corporate Democrats were furious. But Nye's hearings surprised no one. nor did the fierce spring storm of yet another great grassroots awakening. Next, springtime. This land is your land. As the Roosevelts fiddled with our economic mess, armed agrarian mobs, angry urban workers, and aroused young artistes again awakened our indigenous spirit. New Deal social programs confirmed British economist John Maynard Keynes' theory that government spending at the grassroots would jumpstart jobs and recovery. FDR and Keynes did meet and didn't really like each other, but the New Deal's alphabet agencies created income for millions of working people and a future for the American economy. The Roosevelts also kicked in money for murals, musicals, books, plays, photos, reportage, and much more. The PWA, WPA, Federal One, and other cultural projects helped another awakened wave of transcendent creatives survive and thrive. It all came with a strong strain of desperation. While the New Dealers sang of happy days, Eleanor and Franklin faced a cyclical storm surge of radical resistance that forced them to continually tack left. FDR knew his social programs needed to stay a step ahead of the class revolution sweeping the nation. If he didn't succeed as president, he said, he'd be the last one. In the Great Plains, armed agrarians replayed Daniel Shays' rebellion by forcibly stopping farm foreclosures. A Southern sharecroppers union rose up among our most downtrodden dirt farmers. On the rails and highways, mines and mills, docks and slaughterhouses, foundries and factories, militant labor was reborn with a vengeance. Thousands of wildcat strikes raged through the decades. Dozens of strikers died confronting troops, cops, company goons, corporate thugs, private armies, and worse. Working class anger propelled blacks, women, immigrants, and radical organizers far beyond the stuffy AFL. The gruff, tough John L. Lewis and his Congress of Industrial Organizations followed Debs and the Wobblies by organizing whole industries at once rather than just by craft. Hardcore rank and filers demanded payback at every turn. In a strike heard round the world, the newborn United Auto Workers seized Fisher Body No. 1 in Flint. From December 1936 through February 1937, some 2,000 occupiers held the factory while 5,000 supporters circled the building. They camped, cooked, staged classes, produced newspapers, and turned the world upside down until GM finally signed a contract. Beyond the union framework, countless wildcat sit-down strikes, occupations, walkouts, picket lines, insider sabotage, stealth violence, open defiance, and much more spread across the land. The empire did strike back. In South Chicago, cops shot 10 picketing workers in the back at a 1937 Republic Steel Memorial Day rally. But Ford, Republic, and other rubber, steel, automotive, electric power, and meatpacking factories were unionized anyway. Most, quote, malefactors of great wealth, close quote, were outraged by the New Deal's willingness to legitimize the labor movement. FDR said he welcomed their hate. The smarter barons preferred to deal with union leaders rather than with wildcat strikes that could rip them apart without warning. First Lady Eleanor and Labor Secretary Perkins put feminism and unionism hand in hand. Francis helped make the 1935 Wagner Act a landmark for labor organizing. Unlike Wilson's failed Clayton Act, killed by the courts, the New Deal's National Labor Relations Board made a real difference for American workers. Many were African Americans. Jim Crow stole their votes in the South. But in 1936, FDR's social programs enticed Northern blacks to begin leaving the party of Lincoln. They got little in return. Roosevelt needed racist, quote, good old boy Southerners to push the New Deal in Congress, which couldn't even pass an anti-lynching law. Finally, with war raging in Europe, A. Philip Randolph called FDR's bluff. Head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, our biggest black union, Randolph threatened a mass march. After a tense 1941 Oval Office face-off, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802, creating the Fair Employment Practices Committee to monitor federal hiring and kill Jim Crow in the war industry. Throughout the Depression, black activists got heard through the American Communist Party. Its 100,000 members included artists and intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, Richard Wright, Langston Hughes. CP lawyers stopped Alabama from executing 9, quote, Scottsboro boys, unquote, falsely accused of rape. The party made the case a global symbol of American racism. In the end, none of the Scottsboro boys were executed. Most American communists supported the New Deal. They liked the Soviet Union's planned economy, which avoided many of the Depression's worst impacts. But they found the actual USSR and the awful Joe Stalin pretty grim. When idealistic young activists joined the Abraham Lincoln Brigade to save Spain from fascism, Stalin sold them out. His gruesome 1934-35 show trials doomed countless innocents to work camps and to death. His 1939 non-aggression pact with Hitler let him share in the rape of Poland. But when Adolf turned on him, Stalin became our own, quote, Uncle Joe, who Life magazine lovingly portrayed on a 1943 cover. Beneath the red veneer, Stalin was just an exceptionally brutal czar. He enslaved millions in a ghastly gulag, exceeded in size only by the Nazi concentration camps, and then nearly matched by America's Jim Crow drug war prison system. In Detroit in the 1930s, the Catholic radio preacher Father Charles Coughlin supported the Roosevelts and then degenerated into anti-Semitic hate speech. Coughlin's evangelical fascism stretched through the fat 50s and Reagan 80s, all the way up to Donald Trump. Sinclair Lewis mocked such small-minded bigotry in his novels Mainstream, in his popular novels Main Street and Babbitt. Like Jack London's earlier Iron Heel, Lewis's It Can't Happen Here warned of a fascist coup. Louisiana's frenetic Governor Huey Kingfish Long's, quote, share the wealth movement, close quote, demanded $5,000 grants for all Americans. He rammed, quote, every man a king, unquote, into the upstart lexicon. Then, of course, he was assassinated. Reborn prairie populism was put to song by the likes of Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, and the Weavers. This land is your land. If I had a hammer, and other grassroots anthems poured from a banjo that read, quote, this machine surrounds hate and forces it to surrender, close quote. Okies sang such songs as they fled the Dust Bowl eco-catastrophe for California, which became an epicenter of upheaval. In 1934, socialist Upton Sinclair ran for governor, pledging to end poverty in California. Author of 100 books, Upton aimed his muckraking magic at corporate greed, making it clear that, quote, it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. Close quote. FDR betrayed Sinclair, who lost his California governor's race in a huge corporate backlash. But in 1939, populist Governor Colbert Levy Olson ignited 4 years of populist uproar in California before losing to the Republican Earl Warren, who latest became our greatest Chief Justice. In Long Beach, Francis Townshend's massive network of angry elders paved the way for Social Security, which still saves from poverty millions of elders and the children who must otherwise support them. The New Deal's awakened ode was John Steinbeck's 1939 Grapes of Wrath. As a novel and then a Hollywood classic, The Springtime Odyssey of battered class and climate refugees became the era's common sense, Uncle Tom's Cabin, Jungle, quote, "I'll be everywhere," close quote, says our heroic Tom Joad. Quote, "Wherever you can look, wherever there's a fight so hungry people can eat, I'll be there. Wherever there's a cop beating up on a guy, I'll be there. I'll be in the way guys yell when they're mad. I'll be in the way kids laugh when they're hungry and they know supper's ready. And when the people are eating the stuff they raise and living in the houses they build, I'll be there too." Close quote. Movies like Mr. Deeds Goes to Washington and Mr. Deeds Goes to Town became populist classics. So did Frank Baum's not so liberally adapted Wizard of Oz. Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, 1936, trashed corporate greed. His Great Dictator mocked Tojo, Mussolini, and Hitler, who'd adopted Charlie's mustache. But our greatest Marxists were the Madcap brothers, Groucho, Harpo, Chico, and Zeppo. Their lunatic anarchy in Night at the Opera, Day at the Races, and Duck Soup was reborn in the 1960s for a rebel generation that saw them stoned or on acid. In music, the color line finally broke. On June 15, 1933, the Chicago Symphony played Florence Price's gorgeous Symphony No. 1 in E minor. In 1936, William Grant Still conducted his own A-flat masterpiece for the LA Philharmonic at the Hollywood Bowl. Then, Benny Goodman brought the genius African-American Teddy Wilson on stage to play piano with him and Italian-American drummer Gene Krupa, who did Prison Time for Cannabis. The Jewish clarinetmeister was warned of riots if he tried to play on a public stage with a black man. But all that happened was a truly great concert. Later, the King of Swing brought on Lionel Hampton, the Black Vibes Master, to escalate the awakened assault on Jim Crow in showbiz. Meanwhile, an epic struggle erupted over energy and the environment. The electric utility was born of Morgan, Edison, Tesla, and Westinghouse in the 1880s. Mostly it was corporate owned, but dozens of community-based munis reliably shipped socialist juice cheaper, cleaner, safer, and more reliably than the barons' investor-owned utilities. In the 1920s, utility stocks soared, then crashed, but electric demand grew profitably throughout the Depression. FDR's Rural Electrification Administration, and it functioned alongside thousands of legendary Jacobs wind turbines that pumped water, crushed grain, and generated clean, fuel-free electricity throughout the Great Plains. The New Deal's Tennessee Valley Authority and Bonneville Power Administration built massive dams meant to prevent flooding and produce cheap juice, but they soon morphed into Soviet-style bureaucracies that later built nuke reactors, sparked huge defaults, treated their customers like serfs. The New Deal also built a giant aqueduct to bring water to Southern California's new megacities. But the prairies were stripped bare. When the rains stopped, the topsoil baked. Mile-high walls of apocalyptic dust killed crops, turned fields to deserts, made day into night. Homes and lungs filled with soil. Whole cities darkened. So FDR responded by becoming a tree farmer. His Civilian Conservation Corps planted more than 220 million saplings along the Rockies Front Range, slowing dust storms, holding moisture, capturing CO2. New parks, dams, schools, playgrounds, pools, streets, highways, public housing promised hope for ecological survival. FDR's 1934 Indian Reorganization Act got very mixed reviews, but the hated Bureau of Indian Affairs actually got a chief, John Collier, who restored some tribal sovereignty and spoke to the indigenous with an official respect unseen since Wounded Knee. Then FDR stumbled. His National Industrial Recovery Act demanded that corporations cooperate with the unions and the public. The Supreme Court, of course, killed it. Flushed from his 1936 landslide re-election, Franklin demanded an age limit for Supreme Court justices and more seats for him to stuff. It didn't fly. Dictatorships had come to Germany, Russia, Italy, Spain, Japan. We didn't want one here. But as with much else in his life, FDR got lucky. 2 conservative justices swung left. 7 seats open. Liberals like William O. Douglas and Hugo Black got robes. So from the late 1930s to the early 1970s, when Nixon dragged it down, the U.S. Supreme Court certified some of our greatest leaps for human rights, civil liberties, ecological survival, and much more. Unfortunately, amidst the court-stuffing debacle, Roosevelt got cold feet over federal deficits. He slashed key New Deal programs that were working perfectly well. The economy slumped. Keynesianism was confirmed in reverse. But the Depression-era's turbulent spring had revived our indigenous commitment to the well-being of every member of the human tribe. FDR later certified that generous part of our DNA with an economic Bill of Rights. So did Eleanor on a global scale with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The humanitarian sentiments of both of these magnificent documents never became actual law. But amidst the hot summer of yet another war, facing an Axis devil Woodrow Wilson helped create, our awakened humanism and good neighbor legacy gave us the moral high ground. It also brought us the essential allies we would, at the peak of our adulthood, so desperately need. Next, summer, World War II. As the Great Crash morphed and surged across the globe, it led us straight to war. When Hitler, with Stalin's help, invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, America still seethed over Woodrow Wilson's disastrous intervention. We did not want another one. FDR saw the larger danger. He used a Lend-Lease subterfuge to send the British arms and ammunition. He did all he could to get the Germans to attack us. But on December 7th, 1941, infamy struck from Japan. There's a case still to be made that he let it happen. Franklin was an infamous dissembler and a shameless gambler. But he wasn't stupid. A second front in the Pacific, with our fleet in ruins, was a hell of a stretch, even for him. Had Tokyo nailed our aircraft carriers, the Pacific might still be theirs. Pearl Harbor was an imperial outpost in a conquered land, But the attack did, for once in our history, unite America in war. The Revolution, 1812, Mexican, Civil, Spanish-American, First World, Korea, Vietnam, Contra, Iraq, and Afghan wars have all deeply divided us. But against Japan, Americans rallied in near unison. It was Armageddon time for the city on the hill. In our most critical industries, FDR at last became an outright socialist. All that wonky blather about the wonders of the free market disappeared when it came to making sure that the arsenal of democracy delivered the goods. Dr. quote, win the war, close quote, commandeered the auto, airline, mining, milling, agriculture, telecommunications, and other key industries. In the spirit of Gene Debs, but for war rather than peace, America chose a planned economy based on command and control, and consciously at a shared goal. In time of crisis, private profit and corporate greed would not save us. The invisible hand picked up a planner's pen. The result was full employment and a booming industrial machine from 1943 to 1945, with 15 million soldiers overseas. Pretty much any American could get a decent job. At least 2,200,000 women, including Rosie the Riveter, worked the assembly lines. About 400,000 served in the armed forces. Women were paid half what men got for doing exactly the same work. But polls said they generally loved their independence and did not miss their husbands. The crisis that erupted when the men kicked Rosie back into the kitchen and the bedroom rages still. Meanwhile, Jim Crow still ruled the South and most key congressional committees. Blacks were helped by the New Deal. But even during the war, Eleanor couldn't get racist Southern Democrats to pass an anti-lynching law. In 1941, at A. Philip Randolph's insistence, FDR did desegregate the booming arms industry. But riots still erupted. In 1943, 6 whites and 25 blacks died in a single Detroit day. Overseas, African Americans still served in segregated units, but they brought home what Martin Luther King Jr. later called, quote, a marvelous new militancy, close quote, that turned the nation upside down. Navajo code talkers spoke in ciphers that were never broken. They were universally honored until 2017, when Donald Trump, of course, insulted them under a White House portrait of Indian killer Andrew Jackson. Citizens of Japanese descent from California and Hawaii comprised the legendary 442nd Infantry, which tore through Europe and became one of America's most decorated units. But FDR's infamous Executive Order 9066 forced some 10,000 Japanese Americans into concentration camps. Most were second and third generation Californians. They lost their homes, businesses, family, health. Many killed themselves. Eleanor, at least, had the amazing grace to visit one of these horrible hovels. But like the crimes of the reservations, this racist outrage still curses us all. So too the Jewish question. Bitter dispute still rages over how many of the millions Hitler incinerated could have been saved, including Roma, gays, Jehovah's Witnesses, Eastern Europeans, physically and mentally challenged, and countless others. Most infamous are the 930 refugees who came to Miami on the USS St. Louis seeking asylum. Amidst the national furor, they were sent back to Hitler's Europe. Most died in death camps, transported on rail lines. Our military declined to bomb. The U.S. denied visas for the family of Dutch diarist Anne Frank, who died at age 15 in Bergen-Belsen. Quote, "I believe that all Germany's Jews are looking around the world, but can find nowhere to go," close quote, mourned Anne Frank's mother in 1939, 6 years before she could have been saved. Yet on a single astonishing night, October 1st, 1943, the Danish people evacuated some 7,220 of Denmark's 7,800 Jews, plus nearly 700 non-Jewish spouses, over treacherous waters to Sweden. French villagers saved hundreds of children from Nazi slaughter. Throughout Europe, Catholic nuns adopted Jews. Righteous Gentiles saved countless innocents, including my own in-laws. Individual valor, often at great risk, among so many wonderful people whose names we don't know, meant life itself for thousands of refugees who became stalwart citizens and raised beautiful American families. Such wise generosity was rarely matched by self-righteous governments that loudly claimed undeserved moral high ground. For America's white majority, war brought a summer's sense of social revolution. Until FDR began pulling the plug in 1937, the New Deal's hybrid mix of social democracy with corporate capitalism made life better for our battered working middle class. On January 11th, 1944, Franklin proposed an economic Bill of Rights. Mostly read over the radio as part of the annual State of the Union address, Congress approved it as a resolution. In sentiment, this was America's most revolutionary official document since the abolition of slavery and the amendments granting black and female suffrage. In principle, the Economic Bill of Rights confirmed the tribal assumption of every human's right to life's essentials. Framed as a logical corollary to the Constitution, it promised to protect the, quote, general welfare. It was the modern humanist embodiment of the Haudenosaunee-Kanekarova and Madison's Bill of Rights, guaranteeing our religious, intellectual, and physical freedoms. Necessitous people are not free, said FDR. The human community, through a government of, by, and for the people, must guarantee all citizens a decent living. Our tribal family, said the president, had the right to, quote, useful and remunerative, unquote, work that would provide, quote, adequate food and clothing and recreation for all citizens. Farmers and entrepreneurs deserved liberation from monopoly control, good housing, medical care, education, quote, protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment, close quote. These were the universal human rights to be guaranteed by the community, acting through the Congress, the executive, the courts. Rooted deep in our indigenous DNA, this humanist vision is forever carried by diverse tribal activists who repeatedly awaken to push the arc of history toward unity and justice. But unlike the original Kanekarova or Madison's 10 Amendments, the Economic Bill of Rights has yet to become law. Dominated by all-powerful corporations, we remain hostage to poverty, ignorance, bigotry, narcissism, greed, empire, and fear. In 1945, at the peak of our adult powers, we faced two ungodly horrors, Nazi death camps and the atomic bomb. The Allies found an unspeakable abyss. The first victims of Hitler's camps were his political opponents, unionists, leftists, dissidents, social democrats, communists. Then came the scapegoats, Jews, gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, Slavs, gays, humans with physical or mental challenges. Starved, ill, worked, and beaten to death, they died by the millions. In U.S. history, only the Confederate prison camp at Andersonville, the worst of the indigenous reservations, and now our god-awful prison system, approached their utter inhumanity. Hitler loudly admired how the U.S. handled its, quote, Indian problem, unquote. In his own, quote, reservations, unquote, millions perished. At Bergen-Belsen, Allied troops found some 30,000 corpses, including Anne Frank, and barely living, quote, human skeletons, unquote. But at 6 death camps in Poland, the Nazis operated industrial-scale factories for the systematic elimination of human multitudes. Auschwitz-Birkenau, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek, Sobibor, and Treblinka embodied a whole other level of murderous insanity for which the term barbaric is grossly insufficient. These hideous carnal houses say something so deeply disturbing about our own species that we still struggle to make sense of it. Likewise, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower opposed their use, quote, on the basis of my belief that Japan was already defeated and that dropping the bomb was completely unnecessary, close quote. To this day, the U.S. military refers to the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings as, quote, announced nuclear tests, close quote. At first, we denied the very existence of the radioactive horror we now know spans the generations and assaults our biological essence at its genetic core. Then came the suicidal madness of exploding some 2,000 nukes in above-ground, quote, tests, unquote, that filled our ecosphere with deadly radiation that has ultimately killed millions and is still killing them. From 1946 to 1963, from the South Pacific to Siberia and our own desert Southwest, above-ground tests proved one thing. We humans do have the power to wipe ourselves off this planet in an instant or longer term by assaulting our ecological support systems and our very genome. A bang or a whimper, doom either way. But we did have a larger choice, and still do. We could reawaken the vision of our indigenous origins, embrace a global tribal union, live in solartopian harmony with our Mother Earth, and turn our peaceable wealth into a just, sustainable society. Or we could proclaim ourselves the elect of God, wage a doubt-free war on diversity, crusade for global dominion, flirt with ecological extinction, as if it would not really affect us. Sadly, in the chill autumn that followed our hottest summer peak, we chose the road less loving. Next, fall, Cold War, and a second Red Scare. As the World War ended, FDR died at 63. Eleanor did not. In her matriarchal humanism, she helped birth the United Nations. Wilson's Calvinist League had been an imperial alliance, fundamentally racist. Eleanor's United Nations was meant to be a tribal forum, a global rebirth of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, gathering diverse nations into a circle of peace. Her 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights exalted the commonality of all humankind. Newly independent nations like China, Singapore, Indonesia, Congo, the Philippines, and Vietnam now had a place to assert their post-colonial identity. Newly independent nations like China, Singapore, Indonesia, Congo, the Philippines, and Vietnam now had a place to assert their post-colonial identities. In India, Mohandas Gandhi's huge nonviolent campaigns finally bore anti-imperial fruit. Influenced by Thoreau and the Quakers, the Mahatma's Satyagraha forced Britain to quit India. It was an astonishing triumph for the power of peaceful civil action. But when Muslims and Hindus started killing each other after independence, Gandhi refused all food and water. To save his life, the embittered rivals ended their civil war, so the Mahatma, great soul, might live. Gandhi was soon assassinated, with catastrophic consequences that plague us still. But activists seeking peace, justice, and post-imperial independence now had a nonviolent beacon to light their way. In 1948, Costa Rica voted to shed its military. The U.S. also took an apparent leap toward lasting peace. Like Grant at Appomattox offering rations to Lee's men, our conciliatory Marshall Plan extended a gracious hand to 16 war-torn European countries that included the newly defeated German enemy. Despite the carnage they caused, and rather than demanding the reparations collected after World War I, we wisely gave the Germans billions to help them get back on their feet. Quote, "Our policy is not directed against any country, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos," said General George Marshall, the plan's architect. Stalin, unfortunately, didn't see it that way. Most Europeans credited the Soviets with the defeat of the Nazis. At least 20 million of their people were dead, possibly far more. Marshall did offer the Soviets help, but the new Truman Doctrine also pledged armed intervention against any nation leaning towards communism. Direct aid soon went to anti-communist forces in Greece and Turkey, leading to brutal dictatorships. Stalin's protege, Vyacheslav Molotov, toyed with the idea of accepting Marshall's desperately needed American cash. But he and the ever-paranoid Red Tsar saw too many strings attached. So their own Molotov plan, with chains of its own, dug an Eastern European moat against any new Western assault. Separated by a line of subservient dictatorships on both sides, relationships between the former U.S.-USSR allies quickly deteriorated. It was a terrible moment for our species. In suffering the ungodly carnage of a Second World War, we'd slaughtered perhaps 100 million of our own species. From the deepest depths of human depravity erupted the ghastly realities of Hitler's concentration death camps. Atomic bombs ripped through our souls and threaten our very survival on this planet, as would the ensuing disaster of commercial atomic power. After the war, we had that hard-fought moment to come together to heal and revive, to lay the groundwork for a permanent peace. But somehow, we just couldn't handle it. Stalin had his own agenda. As a traditional Tsar, his hero was Ivan the Terrible, not Marx or Lenin. Joe's first thought was to protect Mother Russia from the next Western invasion. For him, the Communist Manifesto seemed to stop with that line about a, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, which he apparently assumed to mean him. A world on fire for social justice was not Stalin's thing. He stiffed communist revolutionaries in 1930s Spain, where they might have seriously slowed Hitler. He did it again in post-war Greece, then in Czechoslovakia and elsewhere. Worldwide, the Soviet presence was marginal, ineffective, unhinged. In 1949, Mao took China. On America's schoolroom walls, the Asian landmass became a great big blotch of scary red. In tandem, the Red Tsar and the Red Emperor were high on the list of history's worst mass killers. Both modernized their countries, advanced industrialization, healthcare, and more. But between their failed collectivizations, show trials, re-education camps, slave labor, prison gulags, assaults on Eastern Europe and Tibet, countless millions needlessly died. Overall, what passed for modern communism in and around the Soviet and People's Republics was a long, long way from anything resembling a worker's paradise. But realistically, neither nation ever posed a tangible physical threat to the United States. The Nazis had utterly devastated the Soviet Union. China was barely crawling out of centuries of desperate poverty. Neither was about to march into Manhattan. Nonetheless, in Fulton, Missouri, 1947, the ousted forever warrior, Winston Churchill, shrieked that Stalin's, quote, Iron Curtain, unquote, was not merely crushing Eastern Europe, but threatening all humankind. China's revolution added a wave of hysteria reminiscent of Salem, 1692-3. Soon enough, the Red Peril would send heathen, non-white hordes pouring into the city on the hill. Enraged and energized by these terrible commie dictators, the U.S. imposed throughout the Third World a toxic stream of equally detestable torturers, murderers, drug dealers, and thieves. Their body count was less than Stalin Mao's only because they raped and pillaged smaller countries. The slightest whiff of social democracy or anti-corporate nationalism would now draw U.S. troops and spooks whose blazing guns and rigged voting machines asked questions later, if at all. As per Smedley Butler, the Cold War became a global update for dollar diplomacy. War was always a racket. Untold trillions poured into the arms dealers' coffers. Under the guise of anti-communism, there were cheap labor and resources to exploit, mass markets to corner, bases to build, kickbacks to collect, rivals to execute. The military Keynesian fear that peace would bring another crash was the true, clear and present danger. And then there was that thing about Christianizing the planet. As with early Boston's Puritan elect, America's wealthy late 1940s elite meant to purify the earth of any economic system other than monopoly capitalism. For our corporate magistrate priests and their Wall Street bean counters to tolerate any financial or belief system other than their own was to doubt their entry into robber baron heaven. The door to social democracy, anywhere, anytime, was to be slammed forever shut. In 1950, Truman and his doctrine sent some 55,000 Americans and countless Koreans and Chinese to meaningless deaths in a sea of bloodshed that ended where it began. In 1953, TR's CIA grandson, Kermit Roosevelt, disposed of Iran's duly elected Mohammad Mossadegh, a social democrat. The ghastly Shah a hideous torturer, paid us back in cheap oil, moral filth, and Persian rage. For the rest of the Cold War era, our nonstop imperial invasions ravaged the Third World. In 1961, with just 3 days left in Ike's second term, the agency murdered Patrice Lumumba, a postal worker democratically elected to lead Congo-Zaire to social democracy. Our ghastly, hand-picked dictator, Mobutu, joined our other imperial puppets by looting the country and terrorizing its people. With that came a permanent war economy, a demand for global hegemony that translated into a home front forever on the brink of totalitarian despair. As George Orwell put it in his classic 1948 dystopian novel 1984, quote, "The war is not meant to be won, it is meant to be continuous. Hierarchical society is only possible on the basis of poverty and ignorance. This new version is the past, and no different past can ever have existed. In principle, the war effort is always planned to keep society on the brink of starvation. The war is waged by the ruling group against its own subjects, and its object is not the victory, but to keep the very structure of society intact." Close quote. Soon enough, things got radioactive. In 1949, as the chairman danced to power, Stalin exploded his first nuke. Hundreds more followed, filling our planet and our lungs with deadly radiation. Some 700 U.S. tests in the South Pacific and Nevada destroyed countless downwind islanders and ranchers. 250,000 of our own atomic soldiers were irradiated. Thousands were ordered to march right through seething ground zeros. They later died in droves. So did John Wayne, Rita Hayworth, and much of the cast of The Conqueror, which was filmed in St. George, Utah, downwind from some of the dirtiest tests. Tons of radioactive sand were carted back to Hollywood studio sets, where the stars succumbed. As with radiation sickness at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and again with Agent Orange and Gulf War Syndrome, and again with 9/11 first responders, and after that with the PTSD of our forever wars, our military denied any possible health impacts on that film crew, the irradiated vets, or the millions of us worldwide whose lungs and ecosystems were poisoned with radioactive fallout. Those who opposed the atomic madness paid a price. To protect us from godless communists out to destroy our freedom and liberty, to protect us from godless communists allegedly out to destroy our freedom and liberty, corporate fundamentalists seriously assaulted our freedom and liberty. The 1940 McCarran and 1950 Smith Acts inflamed yet another Red Scare. The latest army of devils was, of course, blamed on the unionized left. Post-war labor uprisings, including a powerful general strike in Seattle, tore through the mines, mills, railroads, city streets. The baronial elect shuddered in terror. So Congress passed the anti-labor Taft-Hartley Act. Truman did veto it, but mostly he did the Democrat thing of attacking the unions that supported him. Harry also faced black vets returning from yet another world war, more militant than ever. Race hate seethed over jobs, housing rights, political power. Another round of riots erupted. Threatened again by A. Philip Randolph, in 1947, Truman desegregated the Army. In racist response, South Carolina's Democrat Senator Strom Thurmond ran a 1948 states' rights presidential lynch mob. He won Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, and Georgia, where Jim Crow still kept blacks from voting. All the while, by the way, Strom Thurmond secretly supported Essie Mae, his own mixed-race daughter, who kept their secret until after he died. In 1948, alongside Strom Thurmond's presidential campaign, former VP Henry Wallace ran as a true progressive. Henry wanted to end the Cold War, abolish nuke weapons, stop the Red Scare, win social democracy. His grassroots fervor surged with awakened populist socialist ideals. But his quirky theosophist spiritualism and the usual red baiting helped undermine his campaign. The party's 1948 vote count came in under 3%. Meanwhile, the legendary athlete, singer, activist, attorney Paul Robeson was burnt at the media stake by a new round of witch hunters. When the bigoted Ohio Congressman Gordon Shearer at the House Un-American Activities Committee told Paul Robeson to go live in the Soviet Union, the great singer replied, quote, "My father was a slave, and my people died to build this country. And I'm going to stay right here and have a part of it just like you. And no fascist-minded people like you will drive me from it. Is that clear? You are the non-patriots, and you are the un-Americans, and you ought to be ashamed of yourselves." Close quote. The committee quickly summoned Jackie Robinson, who called some of Robeson's statements silly. He later regretted that. But he did emphasize that of the 400 players in the big leagues, just 7 were black. Quote, "The white public should start toward real understanding by appreciating that every single Negro who is worth his salt is going to resent any kind of slurs and discrimination because of his race, and he's going to use every bit of intelligence such as he has to stop it. This has got absolutely nothing to do with what communists may or may not be trying to do. And white people must realize that the more a Negro hates communism because it opposes democracy, the more he is going to hate any other influence that kills off democracy in this country. And it goes for racial discrimination in the Army and segregation on trains and buses and job discrimination because of religious beliefs or color or place of birth." Close quote. By the way, none of those 7 black big leaguers at the time played for the Boston Red Sox. Owner Tom Yawkey's racism cursed their chance to join the great Jackie Robinson and the great Willie Mays with Hall of Famers Dom DiMaggio and Ted Williams, at least one of whose grandparents was Mexican. It took another 57 years and a diverse lineup led by the Dominican David Big Pappy Ortiz for the Red Sox to finally win a World Series. In 1949, KKK bigots attacked a Robeson concert at Peekskill, New York. They essentially killed Paul's stellar stage career. But Robeson still fought against the Cold War and, at great personal expense, helped inspire a civil rights movement that turned America upside down. In 1953, 2 Jews, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, were electrocuted for allegedly sending A-bomb secrets to the Soviets. Like Sacco and Vanzetti, their guilt is still debated. Their killings still reek of ritual murder. In Congress, the new Grand Inquisitor was Joseph McCarthy, a drug-addicted Wisconsin senator who lied about his war record and pretty much everything else. Like a hysterical Salem adolescent, Tail Gunner Joe saw spectral commies everywhere. He got teachers fired, books banned, activists jailed, artists driven to suicide.